Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hiromi Fuyuki of Waseda University. Welcome to Waseda University, and thank you very much for joining this conference. And I'd like to start the first plenary lecture, and it's an honor for me to introduce Mr. Hoensler, Professor Tom Hoensler. I'd like to introduce him briefly. Dr. Hoensler is professor in early modern English literature at the University of Utrecht, the Netherlands. He began his studies in the Netherlands and obtained his PhD at the Shakespeare Institute. His main research interests are the international relations of early modern English literature, such as national identity, xenophobia, writing the nation, forms of translation, and Shakespeare's afterlife. And he has published a number of books, including Images of Englishmen and Foreigners in Drama of Shakespeare and His Contemporaries, Shakespeare's Italy, 400 Years of Shakespeare in Europe, Shakespeare and the Language of Translation, Translating Shakespeare for the 21st Century, Shakespeare's History Plays, the Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare and Contemporary Dramatists, and Shakespeare in Forever. He also has co-edited European Shakespeare and Culture of Commemoration, and Shakespeare and Refugees. He is currently completing Shakespeare Behind Barbed Wire, a monograph about Shakespeare and internment during World War I, and writing a book on the European reception of Shakespeare in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Professor Hoensler is a board member of a number of book series and of International Shakespeare Journal, including Shakespeare Survey, Shakespeare Yearbooks, Career Evidence, and Atlantis. He is also a board member of the ISA, the International Shakespeare Association. Between 1990 and 2005, he was the president of the Shakespeare Society of the Low Countries. Professor Hoensler is also the founding president of the European Shakespeare Research Association, which he headed for 6 years. He was the 2012 One Omega Fellow at Shakespeare's Globe in London, and one of the 6 editors on the Cambridge Guide to the Words of Shakespeare. And today, the title of his lecture is Shakespeare, Subtitles, and the Rivaling Act on the Multilingual and Multimedia Stage. I'm now delighted to welcome Professor Tom Hoensler.
Is this audible? I have to make sure it is. Thank you for that very flattering introduction. It makes me feel very ill at ease. I'd like to begin my paper today, of course, by thanking our hosts in Tokyo for the invitation to speak at the Found in Translation Conference, Jessica Shiba, Hiromi Fuyuki, Norimasa Morita, and Tetsuhito Motoyama. Thank you also for investing so much energy in the topic of Shakespeare and translation, which, due to its sheer range and complexity, can never receive enough exposure and attention. I much look forward to a fruitful conference. The title of my paper is projected on the screen. I would like to thank the organizers for not asking me what I was going to speak about, until yesterday afternoon, which is when I decided to summarize what I've been getting together for this occasion. Not having worked on other things besides translation, it was a voyage back in a sense, and a delightful way to pass the summer reading. Anyway, my topic. In my paper today, I will be speaking about a relatively new, or rather underexposed topic in Shakespeare translation studies. The topic of my paper, as you can see, is surtitles. Surtitles that may translate or explain the Shakespeare performance text on the international stage, where they appear in lights above the stage as side titles, depending on the country, or as so-called embedded subtitles that have been thematically integrated into the performance space. Surtitles themselves are, of course, not new and have a venerable tradition, as in opera. But the arrival of this translation aid on or above the Shakespearean stage is still fairly recent, and we're just beginning to accept them as a standard feature at international theatre productions. I want to look at surtitles in greater detail and define a new mission for Shakespeare translation studies. But before I do so, let me first reconstruct a simplified recent history of the field and its curious position as a subdiscipline of Shakespeare studies. Since the 1990s, much has changed in the field of Shakespeare and translation. By the beginning of the period, translation was still very much the so-called Cinderella of Shakespeare studies. That is to say, translation was acknowledged as a subdiscipline of Shakespeare studies, but hardly considered to be an adequate topic for public debate. It was really a menial activity for non-Anglophone Shakespeareans, and their discussion tended to be relegated to some tiny backroom seminar at Shakespeare conferences. As Stina Eubank put it with regret, and we've all heard this before, I think, she said, the study of translations tended to be regarded by the Anglo-American community of Shakespeare scholars as an interesting and harmless occupation for researchers abroad, irrelevant to mainline Shakespeare studies. Things gradually changed with the cultural turn, because then the concept of translation came to be recognized as the core dynamic of all our cultural and intercultural practices. With it, so-called verbal translation now became only one form of cultural practice among others, and the emphasis of translation gradually expanded from the raising of worldly language barriers to an appreciation of the interaction between cultures in the broadest sense of the term. In many ways, this development was beneficial for Shakespeare translation studies. The cultural turn represented an emancipatory boost to the original translation studies contingent in Shakespeare studies, who saw their field expand and saw their field aligned with, and some come to overlap with, an infinitely broader area of culture-oriented Shakespearean disciplines and subdisciplines: theatre studies, media studies, post-colonial studies, popular culture studies, gender studies. The list is endless. However, it soon became apparent that to the majority in Shakespeare studies, translation was really only a sexy metaphor. One could theorize, speak, and write about, say, the translation of empire, while remaining safely entrenched in the linguistic comfort zone of one's own, often English language. With the benefit of hindsight, therefore, we can conclude that it was only in general terms that the Cinderella of Shakespeare Studies translation had been accepted into the larger Shakespearean fold, because the original or traditional study of the text-oriented or verbal type of negotiation between linguistically and culturally native and foreign tongues still only occupied a minor area of interest, still much different from the rest. The language-oriented scholar devoting his energy to translation, also or even with a culturally trained eye to the art or the craft itself, remained in the minority in the larger field of Shakespeare studies. This state of affairs has not stood in the way of a number of cutting-edge projects in recent years that actually span the entire range from traditional language transfer to cultural exchange on many levels, historically as well as in contemporary terms. I'm giving you a few examples, and this is not to exclude the host of others, but simply because these examples will later become part of my argument. I'm thinking, when I think of what translation studies has produced over the past, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years, I'm thinking, for instance, of a colleague of ours, Lucas Ernen, who initiated a plan to bring the texts of the strolling players back into circulation. For a long time, only few critics had shown an interest in the performance texts that circulated on the continent of Europe at the time of the strolling players, and which had given rise to the earliest continental translations of Shakespeare and his contemporaries into German and Dutch. These texts, as you may know, include The Tempest, Much Ado, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Tides of Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and a lot of other plays not. Since the most important reason for this neglect I was talking about was the language barrier for present-day Shakespearean scholars, Ernen supervised a scholarly edition of these German texts, and with his team at Geneva, devised a smart way to present these newly edited German texts alongside their new retranslations. This means that now we may all benefit from those plays whose political or social-cultural stamp is so very close to Shakespeare's. The work of Lucas demonstrates that our study of the earliest versions of Shakespearean translation as back-translated or retranslated into English may still yield fascinating results. The work has only just begun. Alexa Jovin's Sinophone Shakespeare performs a similar function, namely that of making foreign language Shakespeare, recent canonical Sinophone adaptations in this case, accessible to the rest of the world, in English, with ample attention devoted to language and difference and to culture in the broadest sense of the term. And in this lineup, of course, I shouldn't forget Motoyama, Fielding, and Kono's joint effort to help us reimagine Shakespeare in Japan. We heard about that already, with English back translations of Japanese theater adaptations of King Lear, Hamlet, and Romeo and Juliet, which appeared last year. It is as easy to underrate the effort required to produce such anthologies as it is to underestimate their academic value. But at the same time, it is vital to recognize the other profound message that these anthologies convey, namely that Shakespearean translation studies is not only interested in the properly contextualized exchange of cultures and media, but also concerned with the language or languages that we speak, the original words that constitute those tongues. The text continues to matter. With those healthy signs from the field of Shakespeare and translation and from our contingent, let us return to the subtitles with which I began. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, globalization and digitization have added a complex and fascinating new dimension to the field of Shakespeare translation studies. With the growing popularity of jet travel, emerged what Dennis Kennedy has described as the global spectator, the expat or tourist attending Shakespeare productions and festivals abroad or attending foreign touring productions at home. This international circulation of performed texts has brought into focus, as Geraldine Brody has put it, a new type of theatre translation, the production of texts and performances developed with a primary intention of crossing multiple boundaries spatially, geographically, and linguistically. This internationalizing practice of travel has been both aided and affected by advancing digitization and the concomitant accessibility of new media. As a consequence, the potential expressiveness of the stage has been significantly enhanced. But it has also happened at a cost. If the languages of the stage, as we tend to call them in metaphorical terms, if the visual, gestural, and musical languages of the stage, the intersemiotic variants, so to speak, have been enriched by modern technology, they have also, by intent or as a natural process, it is hard to tell, they have also decentered the verbal construct that we call Shakespeare's own language, his own English, the text, the word. The English of Shakespeare has moved to the surtitled fringe or to the surtitled periphery, to speak with Thomas Cartelli. Surtitles can manifest themselves as side titles and as embedded subtitles, progressively aided by new technologies. They are the main new medium which the Shakespearean text in translation has to be circulated as text. Shakespearean audiences were once invited by the chorus gently to hear, kindly to judge a play. The global spectator of today is still invited to hear the play as a spectator and invited to watch it. But in a process that foregrounds the text as a literary object, he has also willy-nilly become one of the great variety of readers. Today, we are invited to multitask and to take in a number of Shakespearean sub- and sur- and side titles, and if anything remains unclear, we are expected to eke out their imperfections with our thoughts. Surtitles are important, and as such, have not been ignored as part of the international, intercultural, or new media landscape. They have received attention from Marvin Carlson, Dennis Kennedy, the reviewers behind and around the Globe Festival of 2012, Shakespeare in Asia, by Jubin devotes attention to it, and more recently the work of Geraldine Brody, whom I've already mentioned. Yet, in all these cases, we are not dealing with full accounts of the phenomenon, but mainly with a series of isolated instances. Even Geraldine Brody's indispensable article on theatre surtitling really focuses on the single successful production, Ivo van Hove's Roman Tragedies, about which I shall have a little more to say in due course. Also, searching fascination with the multimedial and intermedial creativity potential of surtitle Shakespeare, whereas the more traditional linguistic or verbal component of the medium, the translation itself, is rarely even alluded to. As across the academic disciplines, also in Shakespeare studies, attention is growing for the incorporation of digital technology into stage performance through the use of dynamic projections and live video feeds. As across the disciplines, there is increasing attention for projects that study the movement of the stage into the digital sphere through social media adaptation, one sometimes searches in vain for any reference to issues such as the language barrier, the merits or demerits of verbal translation, or of text media like super, side, or integrated subtitles. A number of years ago, in her Subtitling Today, New Uses, Attitudes and Developments, that's 2007, Marta Mateo spoke of the invisibility of surtitling in reviews and theatre writings in general. This, I argue, still applies certainly to accounts of Shakespeare on the contemporary stage, in the traditional review circuit, as in academic research and writing. The intercultural and intermedial approach to surtitles tends to neglect the projected text itself, tends to ignore both the production of that text as well as the verbal message conveyed by the back-translated words that are projected as surtitles. But perhaps that aspect of surtitles is a mission not to expect from theatre historians or intercultural theory, but from us, Shakespeare translation scholars. I propose we start thinking seriously about the sidelined language of Shakespeare as we encounter it in those often neglected surtitles. I propose we start an international discussion, pooling our resources to produce an objective and inclusive history of the past, say, 25 years. In an attempt to kickstart some kind of discussion, I hope, by way of a number of themes and case studies, I hope in the next 10 or so minutes to show how surtitles really represent a highly variegated field, a field also fraught with many issues, some of which may even explain our neglect of them so far. I look at surtitles in an attempt to convince you that we, as Shakespeare translation scholars, tend to ignore them at our own peril. Surtitles, well read, also in their relation to the other language, may provide unexpected insights into the cultural as well as economic processes that facilitate this mode of translation and, by extension, an insight into the meaning of Shakespeare in an international, global context. My first theme. There is a pervasive attitude of skepticism with regard to surtitles. Notoriously, Dennis Kennedy frowned on surtitles because they were, as he put it, a translation of a translation. Everything I am going to say now about Dennis Kennedy is that if I had to dedicate my paper to anyone, it would be him. So everything is said in the most positive and friendly of spirits to one of our great colleagues. As I said, the phrase "a translation of a translation" is repeated by many of those who write about surtitles. And it is more than a faint echo of the traditional Anglophone skepticism about Shakespearean translation. It is an echo of the criticism one heard when the phenomenon of Shakespeare, who had been simply translated into Spanish or Italian or German, would still elicit the response, Shakespeare, in other words, is not Shakespeare. But wasn't Dennis Kennedy himself the great emancipator of foreign Shakespeare, the scholar who's worked hardest of all to allay the ancient skepticism of translation by arguing that the major post-World War II innovation of the European and English stages took place in productions of Shakespeare in translation on the European continent without his language. Speaking of surtitles, doesn't even Dennis Kennedy reintroduce some of that ancient doubt and distrust? Or have we, for all these years, failed to understand Kennedy correctly? Translation in 1993 meant liberation from the English national straitjacket of Shakespeare's sacrosanct text. Kennedy liked translations because they were, in a cultural sense, subversive and centrifugal. They generated ideas that, more often than not, taught the Brits something akin to a post-colonial lesson. And we've called it foreign Shakespeare, European Shakespeare, Asian Shakespeare. Kennedy appears to reintroduce the phrase translation and translation with translation and translations. He tries to reintroduce, or seems to, the matter of verbal equivalence, the question of essential value, or rather the lack of these two. I think these are matters to ponder, because put differently again, Kennedy appears to be devaluing not only the surtitles, but also their source, their immediate source, the foreign Shakespearean performance text, which tends to be back translated into that particular subtitle. We have a problem of definitions. Just think, there is no reason not to call the work of Erna, Alexa Jobin, with Sinophone Shakespeare, or reimagining Shakespeare in Japan as back translations. But are they then translations of translations, and how valuable then are they? This is, for those who start on this project, a matter to consider. We need to define and redefine translation to appreciate surtitles. I'm continuing to my next point, because I also think it's worth remembering that Kennedy's mistrust of surtitling was in 2009 and was evidently nourished by the conviction that surtitling might, or rather would, undermine any genuine intercultural endeavor, because it dislocated, as he put it, both the production itself and the audience. On that score, one is delighted to see that Kennedy's observations have been challenged by over a decade of intermedial stage activity that has sought, sometimes with stunning success, to resolve the unintended alienation or dislocation effect of the surtitle, mainly by integrating the back-translated text into the stage image itself. What it demonstrates is, and it demonstrates many things, but for me now is, it demonstrates that ideas about surtitles are in a rapid flux. If translation scholars begin their proper research now, there will be a considerable historical backlog to contend with. And when I collect and study the backlog and study explicit references to surtitling in Shakespearean theatre reviews and criticism of the past 2 decades ago, something that kept me out of harm's way during the hot summer, what strikes me is that these references often though with the exception of, say, Al-Hassan's Arab trilogy, would seem to confirm Kennedy's observations. They are references to multilingual situations, not where surtitling works, and but where, on the level of languages, the barrier itself is not raised. Such examples need not be as embarrassing as you might expect. Andrew Dixon has a telling anecdote of the British actor, writer, and director Tim Crouch and his one-man interpretation of Twelfth Night, as told by Malvolio in a production that went to Poland. Finding the audience unusually responsive, Crouch drew on the Polish surtitles to save the day. As Dixon put it, he turned his ineptitude with surtitles, no doubt planned, into a running meta-theatrical gag. He would check the surtitle screen for what he was supposed to say and would attempt to mouth the words projected there with an outrageously poor Polish pronunciation. The reason for the success of his act was that, and I follow Dixon again, the reason for the success of his act was that, unlike most modern touring theatre, Crouch experimented with the barriers surrounding language and culture, bringing them into the same shared, contained space. Put differently, by trying to speak Polish and by dismally failing to do so in front of an audience which itself knew little or no English, Crouch performed the audience's language embarrassment in terms of his own. Or, put differently again, he performed his problem of his own insularity in the language of the Polish host audience. Each of the parties took delight in the existence of the language barrier. Yes, this was a brilliant ploy, but it was the innovative medium of surtitles translations itself that was brought into play, as well as the language concern of the surtitles, but not anything inherent to the Shakespearean text, the actual words from Twelfth Night and whatever meaning these might have had. This was an intercultural encounter between the performer and the audience, not between the performer and Shakespeare. To many, this crisis of a multilingual kind may call to mind reviews of the 2012 Globe to Globe Festival, whose organizers had decided on the use of summarizing side-titled synopses of the scenes in question in favor of line-by-line surtitling. The apparent failure of the surtitling from the reviews that are many in number explains how there were actors in some of the foreign productions who, seeking to communicate with those members of the audience, native Londoners, tourists who didn't speak their language, led actors to insert English into their roles, following which the organizers, in order to secure the authenticity of the foreign production, decided to censor the foreign production's use of English. Such censorship at the Globe Festival also miraculously made the native foreign language the visiting company's greatest trump. Benedict Schofield reminds us of how the Bremer Shakespeare Company, the BSC, began its planned production of Timon of Athens with an ad-libbed pre-show engagement with the audience. A bravura piece, yet one only accessible to the German speakers in the audience, since these moments were without surtitles. For a longer discussion, I refer you to Alexa Jubin's reviews of the festival, as well as the others, and to Alexa's What Country Friend Is This?, which has a marvelous section for those who want to start on working with and against surtitles. There is still an academic discussion to be had here about the advantages and disadvantages of the Globe's approach, although Tom Bird of the Globe has already made up his mind. I hope other theatres or opera houses might be influenced by what we did with surtitles during the festival, he says. How awkward, one may argue, such contending views about surtitles, but competing voices do also convey a sense of urgency. They also bring to mind Karen Bayer's 1996 experiment with her multilingual Midsummer Night's Dream, with actors from a variety of different countries, all acting in their own native tongue. The production was driven by the director's idealistic conviction that a sense of Europe central to her production was ultimately located in the actors' bodies, signifying above and beyond the production's Babylonic confusion of languages. This ambition, however, jarred with the fact that, as Bettina Böcker reminds us, there wasn't a single performance of the production that did not provide a printed summary of the play, electronically projected subtitles, or both. It appears as if we cannot do without at least some form of subtitling, that the language of the play is never entirely communicated by the languages of the stage, and cannot do without the word. And that if no words are given in surtitle form, the production will seek other ways to cater to the communicative needs of the audience. Speaking of the international and internationalizing Shakespeare theatre market, as well as its consequent engagement across linguistic borders through translation, back translation, and surtitles for the stage, one inevitably thinks of Ivo van Hove, the acclaimed Flemish theatre director of the International Theatre Amsterdam, ITA in short, whose multi- and intermedial Roman tragedies successfully toured the world during the early 2000s, and was considered by many successfully to bring Shakespeare into the 21st century, into a production with music, live streaming video, television news, and even a chance for on-stage audiences to check their email in the course of the 6-hour performance without intermission, all made intelligible by means of surtitles on no less than 27 different screens across the set, both separate and integrated or embedded, presenting the text of the adapted plays, each time back translated into the language of the countries visited. And above all, and this is what Thomas Cartelli praises most about the enterprise, above all, surtitles integrated as part of the political statement of the world of politics and screens and manipulating the audience. In recent years, no production appears to have received more critical attention and praise on this score. Ivo van Hove's Roman Tragedies has entered the annals of theatre history as an example of optimal surtitle management. You've got a model. He has become a brand, and thereby, I argue, hangs the tale. To conclude my paper, which isn't over yet, to conclude my paper, I will not speak of the Roman tragedies again, but another production of Ivo van Hove's. A production with the same kind of drive for unity and cohesion, the same verbal near perfection for which the Roman tragedies were lauded, namely the sequel to the Roman tragedies, the cycle known as Kings of War of 2015. Like the Roman tragedies, the cycle focuses on Shakespeare and combines the first tetralogy of history plays Henry VI, 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III, and is preceded by Henry V. It's an example, as I said, of cohesion and unity, and the surtitles also in this case have contributed enormously to its success. This is what any quick search will tell you. I am not going to take you through all these reviews, but there was one that struck me in particular, and I'll tell you why in a second. It was from a review from a production of the Kings of War in Paris, one of the cities that co-commissioned the play, where the review, back translated into English, said, they do not sacrifice, this is about Sertal, they do not sacrifice in any way the language of Shakespeare, translated by Rob Klinkenberg, and transcribed into French in very accessible surtitles. They do not in any way erase the complexity of the language. And the review ended with the words, in Dutch, this is the play, the production is in Dutch, with very good surtitles. I thought, here we are again. This is Ivo van Hove as a brand and being praised on all sides. Now, given the extraordinary praise for a translation which included Henry V, that ultimate litmus test for any translation, certainly into French, it seemed worth investigating the matter further. And it soon appeared that Van Hove in Kings of War actually refrained from linguistic diversity almost entirely. Van Hove leaves out the British dialects of the so-called local nationals and their complex relationship in the play with the King's English. The language lesson has been abandoned, the boy no longer serves as an interpreter, and the only more or less foreign language sequence retained, in part, is the wooing scene. Catherine speaks French, but no broken English, and only on one occasion does she ask for the meaning of the phrase, like me. Catherine understands the King's English almost as well as Henry's political objectives. The language barrier is there, but it is not a main issue. Conversely, Henry understands all of Catherine's French, but he never speaks French himself, nor is he ever made to speak any broken English. So the play is a kind of flattened, simplified version of Henry V, depriving the play of what to many is a characteristic feature. Although most of the explicit scenes have been eliminated from the Van Hove adaptation, the remaining dialogue in the final scene still sufficiently exposes what Emma Virabolova has called the questionable act of linguistic appropriation, which is part of the plot of Henry V. The act of linguistic appropriation in which also the play itself actively participates, thus opening a prominent space of ethical critique. For a better appreciation of the perhaps rather bland way in which Kings of War sidestepped the complex political issue of the play's many languages, and only marginally engaged with it when Henry V invited it, we should perhaps recall Karen Bayer's utopian ideal of her Midsummer Night's Dream. Whereas Meyer performed the play with so many actors speaking their own language and really wanted no surtitles, surtitles are an integral part of the smooth ITA, International Theatre of Amsterdam machine. But the language challenge with Henry V is minimal because the many language barriers in the playtext have been effectively erased in advance. Alternatively, if we set Kings of War off against, say, Albassan's experimental and intercultural Arab trilogy, we must conclude that both the performance text and its resultant subtitles on tour primarily seem to represent a translation for the convenience of a range of national audiences, not a statement about the linguistic identities to be encountered en route. Despite the production's popular success, we are, I think, entitled to dwell on the play's idiosyncrasies a little longer. We may wonder if the Kings of War project did not too easily trade in the heteroglossia, the multilingual and translational potential of Shakespeare's Henry V. The program is silent about the theatre adaptation that delocalizes Henry V in linguistic terms. At the same time, we may wonder about the fact that Kings of War also dramatizes the king's linguistic imperialism and does make this part of a narrative about the triumph of the English language. At the conclusion of Henry V, the storyboard that keeps us informed about the English history we might not know, that storyboard reports of Henry VI, that with him French was no longer a role, or had no longer had a role of importance, and that the English language became the official language of politics, explicitly so. In a sense, a reading of this kind that benefits and that supports the use of English fits the ITA policy to a T, and I'm now contextualizing the production very briefly. The ITA profiles itself as an international theatre company which gladly operates in the, comes the word, global market, and while doing so displays an unmistakable Anglophone bent. As it creates new theatre texts, the first surtitle translation is automatically made into English, and that's for special Amsterdam-based performances that welcome expats and tourists. But this English version also serves as the basis for all other back translations that deserve the name of, in this case, back translations. A final indication of ITA's preference for the King's English, as I shall call it, I can call it that again too, in more ways than one. A final indication of that preference is the title Kings of War, and I'm not sure if you've come across it, but I'm positive that few spectators of Kings of War are likely to have been aware that the title King of War is not, for once, an English back translation of a Dutch adaptation of the history play. The English title Kings of War is the title of the original Dutch production, as well as the title of the published version of the adaptation, available from every self-respecting Dutch or Flemish bookshop, as well as Amazon. English titles are becoming a favorite with ITA, who have more recently also put on a selection of Greek plays under the title Age of Rage, and that too then is a Dutch title. In his highly recommendable Translation and Globalization, Michael Cronin identifies such Englishing as a neo-Babelian response in our global world to see linguistic diversity per se as an obstacle and an argument for the speaking of one language, preferably English. As part of his tendency, Cronin notes, translation is entirely carried out by non-English speakers, and he explains, and I quote him, translation is entirely carried out by non-English speakers. It is they who must translate themselves into English, so rendering translation invisible. I'm giving you the wrong. Translation is carried out by non-English speakers, it is they who must translate and make the text credible and intelligible. Interestingly, at that point, he also gives us a means of understanding the analogy and says, in much the same way as the separate linguistic loyalties, Scots, Welsh, Irish, of the foot soldiers in Henry V are concealed by the unitary English of Shakespeare's Plenary. This is not a book about Shakespeare, but it uses the example of Henry V to carry us along. If we are dealing here with self-translation into English on the part of a global ideal, then it's interesting also to see how, which other example Cronin has to give. He says, the benefits of so doing, of self-translation into English, as I suggest ITA and Ivo van Hove are doing, the benefits of so doing would bring us closer to the mutual intelligibility of what Cronin calls the Babelian construction site. It would be a form of translation to end translation, and evidence of its popularity can be observed in international conference and meetings right across the globe. And it brings us right back to where we are on this occasion, communicating in English for a purpose. All this is not to suggest that Van Hove is in danger of going native, but the joint tendency to erase the language variety from Shakespeare's play for whichever reason, and rather blandly to dramatize a key moment in the history of English and its slow growth to become the global instrument, make it difficult not to think that Kings of War rather uncritically performs the dream of Henry V. The joint tendency that of effacing language diversity and of lauding the territorial expansion of the English language invites a reading of the Kings of War adaptation as the type of script that Anthony Pym, in The Moving Text, the seminal book on translation and globalization, describes as the text written with a reduced lexis and limited syntactic resources, precisely so that ambiguities are avoided when being localized. In a similar context, Miguel Jimenez Crespo would see here the purposeful creation of a delocalized or globalized source version intended to remove features that are language and culture dependent. This is, he says, intended to facilitate the subsequent translation process and ultimately to speed and facilitate the simultaneous translation of different language versions. And the subsequent translation process, I hasten to add, would be the back translation of Kings of War to the subtitle versions for the tour's host countries. Anthony Pym's moving text alerts us to a number of possible analogies between global commercial translation practices and Ivo van Hove's working method with Shakespeare. I would be the last to suggest that Ivo van Hove, a passionate artist with great moral integrity, might, and I quote Crespo again, have purposely produced a globalized Henry V with the same intent as Bill Gates. Bill Gates, who produces his Microsoft software via a delocalized version of the program that can be, as he himself puts it, simply, with one press of the button, translated into any nation's language version you like. Insiders will recognize this procedure as SIMship. SIMship is a common industry procedure to ensure the simultaneous release on the same day of different language versions of software or video games. Insiders will recognize this procedure as SIMship, otherwise defined as a concurrent distribution markets in the appropriate languages. This is SimShip, then, also known as Bill Gates' strategy of simultaneous shipment. Back to Ivo van Hove. Faced with a comparison of this kind, it is difficult to do other than come to Van Hove's defense. The erasure of the joint themes of language and translation from Henry V, as I see it, turned the first part of Kings of War into a missed opportunity, not into an opportunistic miss. In other words, the theatre adaptation and the subsequent surtitles of Ivo van Hove's Henry V strongly suggest that they were indeed kingship and not simship driven. Analogy here clearly is not identical. In the final analysis, of course, the motivation behind the production of Kings of War, if it is a case of kingship or globalizing simship, is less relevant than our awareness that less specific the Dutch theatre text, the easier it is to translate into English, and from then on into the countless other languages in that tyrannical surtitle space. In the final analysis, the motivation behind the production of Kings of War is less relevant than the thought that the delocalized or localized text here marks the final, almost the final step on the way to perfect post-human machine translation of Shakespeare. In my exploratory work on surtitles, I have seen much activity on stage and great neglect in academia. Is this because the actual surtitles are considered functional rather than artistic? Translations of translations, unreliable reruns of unreliable Shakespeare, or even worse? Instructive and useful rather than creative or inventive? Attention, however, seems due if only because surtitles are a vital measure of our engagement with the Shakespearean text in a globalizing world that is, at the same time, relentlessly commerce, media, and image ridden. The place of the word is the ultimate measure of the place of Shakespeare in the world, and if anyone can secure that place, it is perhaps the Shakespeare translation scholar. If surtitles only further acknowledge that language has become less significant, and I'm quoting the genius of Dennis Kennedy, if surtitles only further acknowledge that language has become less significant, they deserve our academic attention even more. What I'm really saying is this: translation scholars of the world unite. Protect and take seriously this surtitled space. With the study of Shakespeare and translation happily emancipated like never before, and language as a medium marginalized on stage, isn't it time for some comprehensive transnational research into the Shakespearean surtitle, into the various more or less creative practices in different environments, but also into the actual language used, accurately cut, pasted, and transferred onto that screen for us, the great variety of readers. Let us agree that in our globalized world, the future of translation is also the future of Shakespeare. Unless, of course, anyone here would like to suggest that surtitles, translations of translations of translations, are really instances of what many others believe to be disposable Shakespeare. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insight of an excellent lecture. I'm so impressed by your sharp argument about the subtitle especially. Thanks so much indeed. The scheduled time has been almost up, but I can take one or two questions if there's someone who wants to please.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I've loads of questions, so I'll just do one. I'm thinking of how in translation, you often get countries choosing really great poets to translate Shakespeare the way Pasternak did. So I'm interested in the subtitles you were talking about, where you interestingly asked about how artistic they are and how functional they are. But I suppose you yourself didn't find yourself naming particular translators. You named directors. And so I wondered whether these subtitles were quite different things from poetic, thoughtful Shakespeare translations, and whether they were functioning in a different way, and whether that was a problem.
Thank you, Tiffany. This is Tiffany's turn, showing how one sits down and gets to work. Thank you for that question. Could you turn it down just a little bit? There's a whistle. Could you turn the volume down just a little? Oh, is that right? How shall I answer this? Yes, you're absolutely right. I've only mentioned one name of a translator, and this was the translator who adapted that King's War. And you're absolutely right that there's a difference, and this goes to the heart of your question. There's a difference at the outset, and then you read into my silence, a difference at the outset between the performance text, so to speak, which is treated as, well, we learn to appreciate as literature, or at least something that you are one spectrum saying, and the surtitle, which is very often anonymous, or let's say the performance text is something which is literary. We go back to Shakespeare here, is Shakespeare's own circuit. It is the text that is prepared most of the time for publication, whereas, and that's where my final word, disposable Shakespeare comes from, that this surtitle is somehow done quickly or by an office, and therefore not regarded as serious, not publishable, and so, I do see that difference between them, and also that in that gap, the difference between them, that there's this distrust, disregard, and when Dennis Kennedy says that, of course I'm very much on his side. I do think I know what he means. My point was to say that what you're now inviting me to do, we have to redefine what a translation is, who does it and what for. Maybe we're seeing a rift between what on the one hand you would have as what Cronin also says everything, in between literary translation and technical translation. That's a spiel that goes back ever so long, and that's at play here too. The only real question is that if we're talking about Shakespeare, then the question changes. Then we're talking about degrading literature, or I have no idea where that might go. But I am facing a kind of gloomy Shakespeare there, which I don't know what to do with. That's why I'm offering it as a question. I'm glad that you raised that here as well. Absolutely, there is a difference, and it needs to be defined, and it needs to be categorized. And since we're talking about multilingual, multicultural, international phenomenon, this is the thing that no one can do by him or herself. This does require the group. This is something that we can only solve together, right?
Thank you very much indeed. the scheduled time has already passed, so I think there are some people who have questions, but please ask Professor Farnsworth during the coffee break time. I'm sorry to you. So I'd like to conclude now, Director Professor Farnsworth. Thank you very much indeed for your excellent lecture.